Paulo, so we have gone through one iteration of game theory. What about in your world, what would be sound and practical game theory?
There is a big interface of game theory and crypto. And it all started with the innovation that brought crypto together, blockchain and proof of work. In some sense, you could say that chain and cryptocurrencies is using cryptography and technology to solve a game theory problem. So let me give a quick rundown. So imagine that you have this problem that you want to keep a ledger of transactions, because that's essentially what blockchain does. It's to keep a record that is shared by other people. And it's something that you want to do it in a decentralized fashion. So you're going to have a lot of people writing in rather than doing in a centralized based on authority. That's the great idea of blockchain. Now, economics and game theory know how to do this. Essentially, what you need to do is to find a way to punish people for trying to write garbage in the ledger if you want to create an accurate record of transactions. The big issue was, how can we implement these punishments in a decentralized fashion?
Right.
If I don't have a central authority that can be issuing punishments, that can be taking away people's monies and putting fines, how do I put these punishments? And then the blockchain, the proof of work came out and showed, okay, you can use essentially electricity costs as a punishment, because you're going to have to put in a lot of work to be writing on this ledger of transactions.
And actually, the very original use of proof of work was for email spam. Before you send out an email, you have to generate a certain amount of work. And when they receive the email, they will verify that this work was done.
And in the case of blockchain, it's this idea that you have to be doing a lot of work and you pick the longest chain. So the work that you need to do when you are acting alone, trying to be malicious, is a lot more. So if you put all of this work to be trying to be essentially cheating on the ledger, and you are caught, then you just wasted a bunch of electricity and work and computational power. And so you get punished by that, because people manage to catch that you were trying to be acting in a malicious behavior, and then you lost all of the work that you did before. And the algorithm does that. Essentially, that was how they found out a way. So if you try to put this, let's do the formalization later. So let's first try to explain a little bit the interface of game theory and crypto. Crypto, all of the things that we try to do in a decentralized fashion, all of the talk about decentralization is essentially talks about implementation theory. What is implementation theory? It's, in a sense, reverse game theory. The idea that we saw before was that you have a game, and game theory asks, what will going to happen given this game, how players will behave. Implementation theory asks the opposite question. Given these incentives, how do I construct a game such that players will behave the way that I want? So rather than trying to figure out what they will do, I decide what they want to do and try to figure out what game I need to construct so that they will act in the way that I want them to act. And this is very related to decentralization ideas. So for instance, blockchain was, okay, given that I want people to be registering transactions in a ledger truthfully, how do I design a system such that it will be in the best interest to be maintaining this truthfully? This is a implementation theory problem. And almost anything else that you're going to be building in crypto, all of these incentive systems that you're trying to make people do something in a centralized fashion, they're all implementation theory problems. How do I design a system of incentives such that they will behave accordingly, such that the equilibrium of this game will be the action that I want them to be accomplishing in the centralized fashion?
I think right now, what has proven to work is penalties. And we all know that loss aversion is a real thing, and penalties will always hurt more than incentivization. And to a certain extent, going back to the previous example that we had, Olympus DAO is a game of incentivization. And therefore, that's why it might not, of course, there is other flaws as well. that might not work as well as a penalty game.
You do have both things in most of the designs. You always have the carrot and the stick. And you can see this in proof of work as well, because the validators, once they validate a node, they get a reward. They mine the coin. So you also have rewards in most of the other designs. And that's how you construct both things. So I think that's for all of Olympus's fallings, the lack of punishment is not one of them. But punishment is the harder thing to create, because rewards you can always be distributed. You can always be giving out your own wealth or something like that. It's all punishment that is like the complicated thing to be creating if you don't have like authority to be administering punishments. It's more complex to be doing than rewards. When I prepared this document, I had one question in mind, which was how to build a more decentralized world. Because as I mentioned, the idea of decentralization, it's very tied to building essentially games and solving implementation theory problems. So the goal of this document is first to give a quick overview of what these areas are and how they tie to decentralization and some kind of results. So we have two twin branches, sister areas in game theory called mechanism design and implementation theory. And both of them are have a little bit to do with the reverse game theory part. The difference between them is very minor. It's something that makes sense more for academics, but both of them are interested in how to design systems and webs of incentives such that you induce a particular kind of behavior on agents under many different circumstances. So you have mechanism design, where you're more like of designing the system, and implementation theory, where you're more concerned of can this system be done? But both of them are tied to the idea of designing games that accomplish certain goals under a very wide range of scenarios. And this, as I mentioned, is tied to decentralization because we are essentially replacing the intermediaries, like the centralized authorities, with incentive-aligned protocols. Rather than having a centralized exchange, you have Uniswap. Rather than having a central bank, you have a web of node validators and so on. And the idea is also that you have mechanisms that are robust, because implementation theory and mechanism design, they're always trying to look at mechanisms that achieve the intended goal over a very wide range of circumstances. This tied a little bit of what we mentioned of Olympus, that their matrix only makes sense under a specific scenario. In implementation theory, you have to have essentially games that achieve the intended outcome under many different states. And we're going to be touching a little bit more on this in detail later. And the last reason for why this matters, why all of this matters for the decentralized world, is talking about decentralized governance, where you need to use dynamic mechanisms to maintain goals without having a centralized management. So all of these things tie back into the ideals of implementation theory and mechanism design. All of these things essentially are related to solving problems in implementation theory and mechanism design. Let's talk about the conceptual framework that we have in these fields. We have essentially 4 different ideas that are the building blocks of this branch of economics. The first one is the idea of a state. And the state is something that encapsulates all of the relevant information to a system. For instance, if you're talking about chain, we're going to have obviously the history of transaction and the pool of pending transactions. These are obviously things that are important. But you could also have things like the current prices of all assets, not just Bitcoin, but other assets as well. Because we want people to be writing the correct transactions, not only when the price of Bitcoin is good, but also when the price is low, or when they wish they had more Ethereum or not. So everything that is relevant to the system is encapsulated on the idea of state. Then you have the social choice function, which is a function that will map every possible state to what kind of outcome you want from that state. So again, for the case of proof of work, that would be essentially a function that says, okay, for every possible state, I want the ledger to reflect the correct pool of transactions.
And just to be clear, when you mean state, are you talking about what we have state as in like the blockchain state?
No, it's broader than blockchain. It's all of the possible states of the world in some sense. Everything that could have happened, like that is relevant to the players that are involved as well. So obviously, information of the blockchain state is important, but so would be information on pool of transactions. Say that a validator doesn't want a transaction to go through, or I want to be like, I don't believe in Bitcoin. I'm a spy from Ethereum and I want to be destabilizing Bitcoin. The proof of work mechanism has to be working under all of these kind of circumstances. It can't be just like, okay, I have a bunch of people that are really nice to one another and a bunch of nodes that are really run by honest people. Everything should work like peachy. Yeah. The kind of state, everything else that is relevant.
Okay.
And the social choice function is a function that maps all of these states into outcomes. For instance, it could be the function of, for a blockchain, a cryptocurrency is this kind of pool of transactions, and I want them to be always corresponding to the correct transactions. So the outcome is the ledger, and given a history of truthful transactions, I want the ledger to reflect that history. So that we're going to be mirroring. But you could have also other kinds of social choice function depending on what you're trying to implement. For instance, because it's this idea of implementation theory is so broad, one other example of implementation theory is constitution. I want to have a system of laws that induce people to be acting as good citizens. I want to have someone to be not committing crimes, for instance. Regardless of whether or not your spouse cheated on you, should not be killing your wife. So that would be another example of social choice function. I want to have a society that has no violence, regardless of what happens.
Why does it have to be a collective outcome?
It's because some of these outcomes go for everyone. So for instance, talking about, say, elections, the president to be present for everyone in the country. And we still have a mechanism. The mechanism is like, we go for the polls and selecting a candidate, and it's going to be like a collective outcome. Or it could be like a decision. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, this ruling will be creating precedents, and it's going to be for everyone. We could have the definition of outcome could be broad enough that we're going to be including also several different individual outcomes. Say, for instance, that the decision of blockchain is to be regarding a distribution of the units of transaction. So that distribution is a collective outcome. And within that, everyone has, okay, my account has this much money and so on. But the output of the system is a single one, which is a distribution of where all of these units of transaction are allocated. So it's a single collective outcome, which is the allocation of this. And obviously, I only care about how much is on my own wallet. But it doesn't change the fact that it's like a collective outcome, the distribution itself. So next we have the mechanism, which is the rules and incentives that are designed to implement the social choice function. So I have the idea that I want to be recording truthful transactions. How do I do this? I go into the algorithm of Bitcoin and proof of work. So this would be the mechanism. It's the kind of the algorithm that you created to be implementing a certain social choice function. It would be the constitution of a country where I created with a social choice function that is achieving prosperity and so on. And lastly, we have the idea of solution concept, which is essentially, once I have all of this game that is defined by the mechanism, how people play this game, how smart people need to be in order to behave the way that I want. Is this a mechanism that is going to be working even if I have monkeys interacting with them? Or am I expecting people that are very sophisticated and can predict other people's behavior? So all of this goes into solution concept. It's a kind of a criterion to select what will be the likely outcome of the game and what kind of scenarios we're going to look into. So if I have a very refined solution concept, it will mean that I don't really care much if certain scenarios will be outside of my social choice function, because I think that rational agents will not be playing that. So for instance, it could be the case that I have a bunch of malicious validators that are going to be writing garbage. Say that I have, I don't know, every node is now run by monkeys and they're just like punching things at random. And obviously, if I have monkeys running things at random, I'm not going to be recording the transactions act because they're going to be choosing whatever. But with my solution concept is, okay, I don't have a bunch of monkeys. I need to have people that are somewhat rational. So I only care about the outcomes that rational people would do. Having every node just sending garbage to the chain and getting rejected and losing a bunch of money, it's not the rational outcomes. About this kind of scenarios. Only scenarios that are made by rational people to be corresponding to the truthful outcomes. So those are the 4 building blocks that we have for mechanism design. And examples of solution concepts in game theory would be Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is a kind of solution concept. This is arguably the most famous and powerful solution concept that we have. And the reason why Nash equilibrium is very famous and is very useful in game theory is that every game has at least one Nash equilibrium.
Okay.
This is the result of popularized Nash equilibrium.
Ooh.
Some other kind of solution concepts, they don't always exist. Like dominant strategies. It's not every game that will have a strategy that is the best no matter what your opponent do. As in the case of Prisoner's Dilemma. Prisoner's Dilemma, it's a special game. It's very simple and it has this property in that there exists a strategy in which is the best no matter what your opponents do. But not every game has this kind of feature. Whereas every game has a Nash equilibrium.
What's a Nash equilibrium?
A Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies such that every strategy is a best response to the other strategies in that set. So it's a little bit abstract, but the idea is that I have one behavior for every participant of the one strategy for every participant. And this set of strategies has a property that if everyone else acts according to that strategy, then my strategy is optimal.
And nobody wants to deviate from
And nobody wants to deviate from that. And you can see, for instance, that the Prisoner's Dilemma, the 1-1 thing, is a Nash equilibrium. That's also another nice feature of Nash equilibrium. If a game has a dominant strategy, that dominant strategy will be a Nash equilibrium.
But just because it's a Nash equilibrium, it doesn't mean it's a dominant strategy.
Exactly. For instance, rock, paper, scissors. You don't have a dominant strategy for rock, paper, scissors. It's not rock, paper, or scissors. None of them is the best no matter what your opponent do. But you have a Nash equilibrium, which is playing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Each one of the 3 actions with 1/3 probability.
Okay.
And you can see that indeed playing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in rock, paper, scissors is a Nash equilibrium, because if my opponent is playing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, then I cannot really benefit from choosing anything different. Every strategy, rock, paper, and scissors, will have 1/3 of chance that I win, 1/3 chance that I lose, and 1/3 chance of a tie. Since I don't have any strong incentive to be playing rock, paper, or scissors, I might as well randomize between the 3 of them and play each one of them with 1/3. So I don't gain anything by playing any other strategy differently.
Can I ask then, do you think that blockchains and the way the decentralized ecosystem is built, it's fundamentally economic gain versus technical one? It's like the technical part serves the economic gain.
I think so. I think it is an economic game. I think that the technical, all of the technology is enabling this game to be constructed. As I mentioned before, the big innovation, in my opinion, of crypto and blockchain is to figure out a way to use algorithms to be imposing costs that we can solve. We already need a solution for this in economics. We just never knew how to implement this, how to put this cost. But we knew for a long time ago that if you want to be creating this kind of decentralized system, all you need to do is to be putting some kind of punishments and incentives for people to be maintaining the ledger honestly. But we never knew how to be giving these punishments. Same thing, like we all knew that to be preventing people from sending spam email, you need to be putting some kind of penalty for them. The big trick was, okay, how can we put this kind of penalty?
Is it a penalty or is it a cost?
I think in Bitcoin's case, the penalty is the cost.
Yeah,
It might not necessarily be the same for all situations. Because in this case, there is a cost to participate. That's why that is the penalty. But some situation where there's no cost to participate, but then of course you lose something in return.
in Bitcoin, I think when I mentioned the penalty and cost is the same thing. Like I try to write to essentially send a malicious block to the system, and I need to spend a lot of energy, computational power, so electricity computational power to send that malicious block. It was rejected. So all of that computational power and electricity was wasted. So that was my penalty for trying to game the system.
For example, of a situation where the cost is not the penalty, right? So for example, KYC Launchpad, right? There is literally no cost to take part. But then the penalty, if you were to be malicious in such Launchpad, is that because it's KYC, then you lose out in the next launch, for example, the next ICO or next launch. Yeah. But of course, this is with reputation into it.
I do think that that blockchain is essentially like an economic game, and the technology aspects are there to reinforce this economic game. Not just like for blockchain, but like a lot of the stuff in crypto, the DAOs. I also think that DAOs essentially, first of all, I think that they are the most interesting idea that have come out from blockchain. I think that currency is nice, but having this kind of decentralized coordination is a lot more interesting and open a lot more doors. And they're all kind of economic problems that you're trying to solve by using algorithms and code. So let's talk the limits and trade-offs of decentralization. Because as I mentioned, this is all of economics, and there are a few results that we have already from this branch of economics that tells us, first of all, that not everything can be decentralized. So there are some kind of costs to trying to insist in decentralization. Because otherwise, you could always argue the question of why the things were centralized in the first place. Because centralization is much easier to achieve. And in some cases, the only kind of system that you can have. So the first result is that only certain social class functions can be implemented. This comes again from results in implementation theory. For instance, one very common requirement is that social choice functions need to satisfy a property called Maskin monotonicity. And this Maskin monotonicity is a kind of like your social choice function needs to be not only reactive, but it needs to be aligned with incentives. So that, for instance, if an outcome is selected in a particular state, it must also be selected for all states in which the support for that outcome among agents has improved. Putting an analogy with an election. If a president is elected with, say, 50% of the votes, the president has to be selected if he gets 80% of the votes. It cannot be the case that, okay, you got more votes, so you're going to be losing the election. That's the idea behind Maskin monotonicity. So it shows that you can never design a system that will have like a president losing an election if he gets out of votes. It would just not work.
It's bad for everybody else. So you're saying the winner of this election, it has to benefit everybody, that like the majority of the people.
Not only it has to benefit the majority, but if the system selects a candidate with a certain threshold, gaining more votes, it shouldn't change the outcome. What is growing. And why is that the case? Because if it was the opposite, if I try to design a system in which I'm going to select an outcome and then change whether, like, is the support is growing, people try to game the system. They will not be voting for the candidate. They're going to be voting for other candidates and trying to be a bit cheeky with their votes. This is like one of the requirements for implementation. The other kind of result that we have is that some goals, some decision-making goals are inherently incompatible with decentralization. So full decentralization is impossible without some compromises. And the key example for this is the one exemplified by Arrow's impossibility theorem. This, again, it's a little bit complex to be explaining. I'm going to try to give my best shot at a second version of Arrow's impossibility theorem. But it says that if I have 3 or more possible outcomes and have no prior information on the agent's preferences, any system that can be implemented is either centralized or is going to violate unanimous decision. What do I mean by that? It's going to be violating a case in which everyone has a clear preference for an outcome and that outcome is not selected. So say that, for instance, in the case of elections, you're going to have a circumstance in which 100% of the population supports a candidate and that candidate is not elected. So any system that is implementable in a centralized fashion, it's either centralized or going to violate unanimity. That is like one of the most beautiful and mind-fucking results in all of economics. It's no wonder this guy won a Nobel for this. Actually, a lot of things. Arrow was a beast, but this is his most famous theorem. But again, the point really is not really to understand that much Arrow's impossibility theorem. This is something that takes a lot more time. But just to mention that there are some things that you cannot do in a decentralized fashion.
So what you're saying is this. So there's 3 of us, and we each have a preference on who should be the president. But we don't know what each other's preferences are.
It's not about that we don't know. It's that the person that's designing the system. So we have 3 of us are the citizens, and someone is writing the constitution. And I don't know what the citizens will have of preference, either because I don't know them or because I designed the constitution not only for the citizens today, but for generations to come that have not even been born, and they could have any kind of preference. So if I don't know this kind of information, then there is no way of making a system that is either decentralized or violates unanimous decisions. So the idea is that there's going to be a dictator. This is the cheeky way of that you can explain Arrow's impossibility theorem. The idea is that you will have someone that no matter the result of the election, he voted for the winning candidate. Again, this is complex. And I can send links. I don't expect to be able to give a good explanation of Arrow's impossibility theorem in even 5 minutes. It is.
So he was the founder of social. Sorry, Han, what you can say?
Yes.
In the most recent election in where we live in Singapore, is that Arrow's impossible theorem? Because there are constituency where there are like 4 corners fight. So that fulfills the first one where there's 3 or more possible outcomes. And obviously we don't have any information on everyone's preference. So is that Arrow's impossible theorem?
It could be.
What are you trying to say, bro?
Does it mean that the system, the implemented system is highly centralized?
So it could be highly centralized, but in the case of democracies, the most common flaw that happens, it's not that you have a centralized system, is that you're going to have some kind of system that you have either cycles, that is the Condorcet paradox that you can see in a lot of like voting systems. So you're going to either have like Condorcet paradoxes or what we call a dependency of irrelevant alternatives. So that if you add up another candidate, it changes the outcomes. So you got to have some kind of flaws essentially in your mechanism. Have what you actually implement is different. You're going to have the rule generated is not what you want it to be. You're going to have something, you're going to achieve something, but in some circumstances, the candidate elected not going to be reflecting the majority of population.
I guess for today is a good enough explanation.
I saw Arrow's impossibility theorem yesterday.
And the idea is that with these 2 things, it imposes also some other kinds of costs for insisting on decentralization. So if decentralization is not something that you are willing to compromise, then you need to compromise on your goals. Like you're going to have to accept some second bests because either by doesn't satisfy monotonicity or falls into error impossibility theorem or some of the many variants. It means that you're going to have to implement something that is not quite what you had in mind. Again, another kind of example for this one is more tangible.
But it is very common in DAOs, right? There are some proposals that are clearly very beneficial in the long term, but then they are not implemented in DAOs because they simply don't get enough votes. And then there are some very silly proposals like token buybacks, for example. Now it's the trend. We do get a certain benefit, but then, like, it's not the best case scenario where that money is used for ZK stuff, can be used to improve whatever tech, can be used for maybe a third audit, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a big conundrum for DAOs. They have the technology, but they don't have yet the economics of getting good decision systems. And it's hard. I don't like to demerit, but I feel like there should be more research into how to develop good systems for decision making in DAOs. But even outside of DAOs, I can give another simpler example of cost of decentralization, which is for auctions. The idea of an auction is that you want to be allocating an object to whoever has the highest valuation for that object, and you want to be getting some reward in return. And a result that you get from economics is that you're never going to get to be paid what the object is worth on an auction. You're only going to be receiving a compensation that is, on average, equal to the second highest valuation. And
Yeah, the second price auction. It's what Google uses, but that's how you get the truthful outcome. The truthful bids.
the truthful bid becomes optimal because what happens is you try to make a first price auction. You still want to get the second valuation in on average. It's just that people try to be just bidding a little bit below what they actually value. So they're trying to game the system. And what the results show that is that because people can always kind of game the system, you either want to make it more complex for them so that you have to always try to estimate what is the second highest valuation, how much you can be bidding below, or you can make a very simple system in which you have no incentive to try to game the system. You just bid your valuation right away.
That's actually super cool. There was a study where Google they originally, for ads, I think what they did was they were using the first price auction because it was like easy to implement or something.
Yeah.
But then when they implemented the second price, I guess the victory auction or something, the revenue, it either went up like 30% or it went up 3 times. I'm not sure which one it was, but it's crazy.
Fun fact, the guy who put like the second price auction and was like the chief economist of Google is a famous economist that write textbook economics. So a lot of students, myself included, study microeconomics from his textbook, Hal Varian.
Really? Oh, Hal Varian. Hal Varian.
Yes.
Chief economist at Google. What?
Wow.
And a professor at California, Berkeley. Wow. Especially on microeconomics information. This is crazy. Okay, got it.
So again, you can talk that this is a cost of decentralization, that you can never get the first lesson to come. You can never get the full valuation of the person. Though, as that example shows, if you have a good design, you can make it easier for people to be playing your game, and you can reap some rewards from it.
Can I ask one question then?
Sure.
You know how there's always like a trilemma, right? There's a decentralization trilemma where you can have decentralization, security, and performance. Things like this necessary condition for implementation, Arrow's impossibility theorem, technology costs, and all of this. Is it validating this trilemma? Or is this saying something totally different?
I think that it's validated this trilemma because it's something that you see in reality, the idea that, okay, you can scale, but you're going to have to compromise, say, decentralization. No one can argue that the scale of centralized payments like Visa or fiat currency, it has a lot of scale and you have systems. It's just that, but they are centralized. So what is the why do we have this trilemma? It's part of it because you need to sacrifice a few things if you're trying to build a decentralized system. And this trilemma is a reflection of these problems of decentralization. So if I am insisting on decentralization, then I'm going to be either running into more security problems because I'm having like more people with access to stuff, say that I am allowing more people to be writing on my ledger of transactions, or I'm going to have issues with scalability because I need to be providing so many incentives that it becomes more costly rather than having security at a very cheap cost because you only need to secure one person, one point of access. So I think that it really feeds into the issues that I mentioned before, like the cost of decentralization. Almost every time, this is something that I'm getting sick and feeling like also a little bit guilty because it feels like every other session of the white paper reading club, whenever someone is presenting some new solution for helping blockchain to scale, and they're always like, okay, yeah, the secret sauce is centralization. You're going to have someone who is going to be holding all the power. It's always, that's what I feel like. It's always that.
Yeah.
That's the entire premise of L2s.
It's like the one that I think people care initially least about, and it's the easiest one to sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
So it's, oh, we're hungry. Who are going to eat? Oh, let's eat the fat kid. Well, that's it. It's like you pick on, it's like the weakest link in some sense. But it's actually the most important one because we have scalability, we have security in existing system. This is the one we don't have.
Yes.
I think it's not that it's the weakest link, but it's the most invisible one. You don't feel it immediately.
I guess it depends a little bit on the situation. For instance, you can sacrifice decentralization if you're trading with partners that you have very frequent interactions and so on. So you don't really need to have all of the things that are required by decentralized structures. Same thing like with security. If you really trust someone, then you don't need to be like that secure. Do I need to be jumping all of the hoops of decentralization and involving validators and whatnot if I just want to send $5 to my father? Like I could just be creating some kind of layer 2 that allows this to be happening much easier on the premise that neither me nor my father is going to be playing like an asshole. Might be a strong premise for some peoples and some fathers, but like I think that, for instance, this is like one of the ideas of Lightning Network, where you have frequent trading partners that will be interacting with each other very frequently. They have some level of trust with one another, and so they want to open this channel for being like pushing back and forth some transactions between them. Right. So you can argue that, okay, you are compromising arguably both security and decentralization for this, but you're gaining a lot more scalability because the costs are much lower.
Right.
But is it really a sacrifice? If you are trusting someone, you are essentially leveraging on a trust that already exists between the participants. So it's like costless in a sense because you do trust supposedly all of the partners that you are entering the channel.
Thinking in that particular aspect, you're still just sacrificing decentralization, isn't it? Because yes, Lightning Network will still be secured and whatnot. It's scalable between two partners, but because it's just two partners, then you are just sacrificing on decentralization. It's still the same. It's still the same issue.
I get what Han's trying to say. Han's trying to say like you're not sacrificing security because it's. But I have a thought. Do you think it's like this thing, like the yin yang thing, right? I feel the thing is we look at the trilemma as a static thing. Something like this yin and yang thing it's like dynamic. It's actually constantly changing. And stuff that's good will have to be bad one day, vice versa. And there's a little bit of me and you and me. And when I look back at the trilemma, I'm wondering if this should be more of, it's like a dynamic thing that's like rotating. So because we've had decentralization with Bitcoin and stuff, we don't value as much anymore. And we value security. And then now we're thinking about scalability, right? We just want fast stuff. But at some point, you're going to come back. You're like, no, actually, we want decentralization because governments are participating again. And then it's like They're like flowing things. It's not discrete. That's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, I think there's really like an entire spectrum over them. It's not even decentralized or scalable. It's okay. It's a point in a scale. How decentralized it is, how scalable it is over a big spectrum. And same thing with security. No system is 100% secure, but you have, again, a big spectrum. Some systems are more secure than other and more than other and so on. But going back to your point of that's always emotion, I think what is emotion is the needs of people. I mean, people have different needs at different times. If I trust the government, I think that everyone is good, then I don't need decentralization. When the government now is corrupt, then I value centralization more. If I interacting with people and I just got hacked yesterday and stole my account, then fuck, security is the number one.
Yeah.
If I am like having to pay high gas fees and scalability. So it always depends on what you need, what kind of problem you're currently facing, what was the latest problem. They want to sustain you the most. If I am someone who is very rich, then the costs are not really that issue. Security is not more important because I might lose $1 million.
Yeah.
So it depends. It shifts with the necessities, the population, and these necessities are very fluid.
Yeah. So just to end on that bit, I think early this year there's a layer 2 that kind of emphasized the need for decentralization, right? Because long story short, that layer 2 upon first launch had a shit ton of meme coins, and they essentially don't want so much meme coin because they are backed by a very reputable Web2 company. So they shut off the entry point for that. And those people who actually bought the meme coins couldn't sell. So yeah, so that was like the crux of centralization for them, right? Yeah. So that's where everyone is bitching about why is it not decentralized and whatnot. Yeah. And it's just for that 2-3 days that people care about decentralization. Let's get back to scalability and yield farming.
Like I got food poisoning a couple of times. And every time I get food poisoning, I'm like, it's like the worst experience. I don't know if you guys got food poisoning.
Yeah.
It's just, there's just so much pain. There's nothing you can do. You just sit on the toilet and just like pray or something. Every time that happens, I'm always like, you know what? I'm going to be a good person again. I'm going to live a healthy life. I'm going to not drink. The next day, as soon as the food poisoning's over, you go back and do like your thing again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just final thought that we can do decentralized and building more decentralized institutions, organizations, mechanisms, but we need to essentially use more decentralization. Like the question is not whether we can build, it is how cleverly we can design. We did a few things already using these ideas of implementation theory, and we got very good results. And I think that we shouldn't just stop at that. I think that we can achieve more better things using the ideas of game theory, implementation theory, mechanism design. We can build better using technology and economics to be designing better systems. We have already like the blueprints, the laboratory. It's just like playing with these ingredients more.
Yeah, I think that's quite very worded.
Agreed.
It's been almost 3 hours.
Yes.
We had it on the calendar. I don't know. I put it in
30 minutes.
Yeah, I put in like 1.5 hours. I was like, you know what? Maximum. I put in 2. I was like, oh my God. I want to say that I feel so honored and grateful to sit here and just listen. Like I learned so much during this.
Thank you.
Me too, man. There are some parts which I definitely don't understand. But yeah, I think what's helpful is the debate, like trying to make sense of what it is. I think actually we had a structure where we want to do this thing where we try to wrap up the entire series, with the entire podcast with an analogy. And you can throw us whatever wild card you want. But I guess we naturally did it along the way.
That implementation theory is a blueprint, Web3 is a lab, and now we just have to build it.